Welcome again, everyone. As you probably are aware, this year marks the 125th anniversary of Rock Creek Park, that treasure in the middle of Washington, D.C. CCHS is commemorating that anniversary today, as we did with our last program last fall. In November, our program featured two speakers, both of them authors of recent books about the park. Scott Einberger spoke about the history of the park, and Melanie Chukas-Bradley shared her extensive knowledge of the natural wonders of the park. If you missed that program, you can still see it by going to our CCHS website and clicking on the link to the video, which will take you to the film on YouTube. But today, we are focusing on one of the most fascinating features of Rock Creek Park, namely Peirce Mill. Thousands of commuters drive down Beach Drive every day and pass the historic stone building at the intersection of Beach Drive and Tilden Street without knowing what it is or without understanding the important role that it played in our local history. Well, today we are going to learn the story of Peirce Mill from the person who perhaps knows it best, Steve Dryden. For 18 years, Steve has served as the Vice President and Program Manager of the Friends of Peirce Mill. This organization raised over $3 million to finance the restoration and reopening of the mill to the public in 2011. Steve has written the first comprehensive history of the mill, and his book will be available for purchase and signing out in the entryway after the lecture. Steve is a person who has truly made a difference in the natural environment of Washington and Rock Creek Park in particular. He is the founder and director of Rock Creek Songbirds, an initiative to restore habitat for migratory birds in the park. He was a co-founder and board member of the Rock Creek Conservancy, dedicated to protecting the land and waters of Rock Creek Park. In addition, Steve worked for the Audubon Naturalist Society, where he continues as a volunteer, and has served on the board of the Montgomery Countryside Alliance, working to preserve the 90,000-acre Montgomery County Agricultural Reserve. In another facet of his career, Steve has been a journalist, reporting for Bloomberg News Service, United Press, Business Week, The Washington Post, among other publications. We are delighted that Steve has also agreed to lead a history go-round tour of Peirce Mill for CCHS on Saturday, April 11th at 11 a.m. Having Steve as our guide will make this a particularly special tour of the mill, and we hope that you will be able to join us. You can sign up for that tour at the table in the entryway after the lecture. And lastly, I want to thank the other members of our program committee who joined forces to organize today's program and the History Go-Round tour of the mill, Marianne Hoffman, Gail Sansbury, Catherine Cesari, and John Murtaugh. So please join me now in welcoming Steve Dryden.
Thank you, Mary. Can everybody hear me? Good? Okay, great. Well, let me adjust something here, because I have not been here for 200 years in the nation's capital. Actually, it's Peirce Mill that's been here for 200 years in the nation's capital, and I doubt I'm going to make it as long as the mill stands. That mill is going to be there, I think, until the 25th century, given how much it has survived, floods, storms, almost tsunami-like conditions we've had. The water has gone into the basement all the way up to the ceiling many times, and continues to do that even though they re-engineered the berm around it. In any event, I'm really happy to be here today, and I appreciate the invitation to come talk to you about Peirce Mill. I'm going to give a brief sketch of the history of the mill and the family that created it and maintained it for so long, and then I'm going to veer off a little bit into a different emphasis in a way. I'm going to touch on a couple of things which you normally wouldn't associate with mills, but actually in the process of research I came across these things, and frankly it got even more fascinating than the history of the mill itself, which some of you probably would think that's not too hard to do, but these three subjects I'm going to touch on are miraculous healings, Hollywood, and Quakers who held slaves. Okay, so let's start at the beginning, of course, with our actually the painting here, which has been around for a couple of decades in the possession of the Park Service. We don't know where it came from, but that is been dated at least 1840. And as you can see, we'll almost see here, this is Tilden Street coming down to Rock Creek. There's no bridge, and that was a ford at that point in the history of the mill. But the mill pretty much resembles the way it looks today, and the back door is right there. So again, we don't know who painted that, how it got to the possession of the Park Service. It's one of these things, I discovered that a lot when I was doing this research, that there's all these bits and pieces which have come from different different sources, and no one really noted that. But actually, there is a lot of material that is available in the Library of Congress and especially in the National Archives, because the Peirces, because they lived here from the late 1790s forward, all of their court records for whatever was going on, probates, wills, that kind of thing, they actually were preserved by the United States government in the National Archives, because until 1870, the DC didn't have its own archives. So one of the things that was really fun to do was to come across a lot of material that I don't think anybody had opened up in 150 or 200 years. I mean, there were warrants, fines, all kinds of things from 1812, 1820, and they had been packed away very nicely by the archives staff who knew how to handle these materials, but they were very crisp and very delicate. So let's get started right away, and in reverse order, we'll talk about the Peirces as slaveholders. You know, the Peirces were a family in the Quaker heartland of Pennsylvania in Chester County. Their forebears had come over probably in the late 1600s and settled there and did well as millers and farmers. And at that point, they spelled their name Pearce, which was to change. But they did very well, and I think they did so well that by the time of the Revolution, the sons were looking for opportunities, and there really weren't any opportunities around Philadelphia any longer, because all the land had been bought up or was, being given to other sons. So somehow, and I'm not sure, we don't know how they chose the Washington area. Of course, at that point, it wasn't Washington, it was Maryland and Virginia, right after the Revolution, to come down. Isaac Peirce, cousin of his, Abner Cloud, and another cousin named Jonathan Shoemaker. And they sort of, again, I don't think they had any inside dope on what was going on, but they bought land in what became the nation's capital. But this was the 1790s, when things were still very much in flux. And it was a good choice, of course. Isaac Peirce was I guess you would say, the patriarch of the family. And he was the one who bought the land around where the mill is today. And it was a couple of dozen acres at that point. And we believe from the records there was a mill on that site already, but he did well enough to, within a few decades, build this structure, which is dated around the 1820s, and it's got that on the eave up there at the top of the building, actually carved into stone, Isaac Peirce and Betsy Peirce, IP and BP, that was his wife's name, 1820. So quickly, they established quite a farm in that valley of Rock Creek, and the mill was just one facet of their business. They started buying land, and they were doing very well as landowners. Now, as I said, they were a Quaker family, but when they came down, the Peirces, they, and the Clouds too, Abner Cloud, they had managed to get themselves drummed out of the Quaker faith. Isaac was, I think, presumed to have been holding or known to have been holding a musket during the Revolutionary War years. I don't know if he used it, but he wasn't supposed to have one, so that didn't help him out. And the other, Cloud did. And then Isaac Peirce actually married a woman, Betsy Cloud, who was the sister of Abner Cloud, in a ceremony officiated by a Baptist minister. And you're not supposed to do that if you're a Quaker. So they were out. Their feelings about it, I'm not sure. We don't have any letters of that sort of thing. But in any event, this happened all around the turn of the century, 1800. And that meant that they could kind of make a new life and identity for themselves in a sense. I mean, Quakers had a lot of different degrees of seriousness about their faith and that kind of thing. But at that point, they were in new lands with new rules, and it was, as we mostly know about that area, it was a fairly southern territory below the Mason-Dixon line. And so they became part of the southern culture of this area, and they began to own slaves. And they actually owned about 35 enslaved men, women, and children by the time of the Civil War, and were actually the second largest group of enslaved persons in the District of Columbia at the time of the Civil War, because there weren't any big, Anacostia had a big farm, but most of the city and the countryside, you didn't have the kind of large plantations that you had in other parts of the South. Although the Peirces did call their farm the Peirce Plantation, but that wasn't because they were growing cotton or anything like that. They actually had a fairly conventional farming operation, and they had lots of land with lots of wood, timber. And that was one of the reasons they became a very wealthy family by about the time of the Civil War. So let's advance through here a bit. This is a map showing you the location of these three families throughout Washington. The familiar diamond. Peirce Mill is right in here. The Clouds, Mr. Abner Cloud, is built the Abner Cloud House, which is still on the Scino Canal. I'm sure many of you have visited that. He had a mill there. Although, interestingly, I didn't really find much in the archives of D.C. about his milling. I found a lot about his fish. He was fishing and selling fish big time, making a lot of money off of that because the Potomac was right there. And then the third family was the Shoemakers, who had land south of Peirce Mill on Rock Creek. Jonathan Shoemaker built a mill there, and it's most famous for the fact that after before he got rid of one interesting thing happened. His son went down to work with Thomas Jefferson on Thomas Jefferson's mill, and it didn't work out that well. And I'm not sure if the son was to blame, but there was a little bit of bad blood between some of the Jeffersons and some of the Shoemakers. But interestingly enough, Thomas Jefferson wrote John Shoemaker and said, "Let's bygones be bygones. I'm not going to hold it against you." So at least in that respect, he didn't suffer. His reputation didn't suffer. But I think he, for whatever reason, didn't really want to continue in the milling business. So he sold it. And it eventually ended up in the hands of the former president, John Quincy Adams. And so it became known as Adams Mill, or the Columbian Mill. And that was located right next to the National Zoo on the other side of the creek. And there is a marker there, but there's nothing left of the mill. It was washed away. And poor John Quincy Adams thought that he would have a source of income in his older age, but he evidently didn't hire the right people, or the conditions were not favorable, because he quickly started losing money and sold it. It went out of business. So the Peirces, though, who were in the right place with the right kind of water flow and had good business sense and hired the right kind of helpers, I suppose, they just continued to do very well. And even though it was not a big commercial mill, they stayed in business. People would come from all around the countryside with their wagons full of grain to be milled there, and they would take it back, leaving some for the Peirces. They had a big orchard. This is the square right there with the dots, right next to the mill. And then one of the sons of Isaac Peirce actually opened a nursery right over here where the Klingel Mansion is. His name was Joshua Peirce. This is a family tree, which I had a lot of fun doing, and a great artist put it together for me, which shows the development of this family throughout the 200-year, well, almost 200 years presence here. And we start with Joshua Peirce back in Pennsylvania, his son Isaac, who came here, the Clouds, and the Shoemakers, all of them come through here and started having big families and started intermarrying, as Quakers tended to do, I believe. So we ended up with some interesting name combinations, including Peirce Shoemaker, who was the patriarch, really the last farmer, the last guy who was close to the land on the Peirce estate. And he was the owner from around the 1840s until his death in the 1890s. And after that, at that point, the milling business, which had been really big in the mid-Atlantic, and especially around Washington during the Civil War time, declined because the Midwestern mills and other mills were coming on at that point, and they were they could supply much cheaper flour. And it became more of a place to grind, Peirce Mill, to grind animal feed. And by 1896, it really was more of a sentimental possession of the Peirce family, the Shoemakers, and they kept it open. But that same year, the wheel broke, or the shaft on the wheel broke, and so they had to close it. And about that same time, the Congress had created a park in that area. And in fact, they bought most of the land for what became Rock Creek Park, or a good part of it, from the Peirces and the Shoemakers, because the Peirces and the Shoemakers had ended up owning a lot of land up and down Rock Creek. Here's Joshua Peirce. They had bought up a lot of land, and so after the Civil War, they were very well positioned to sell this land for property development. They had a lot of wood for timber and lumber. So they were doing very well. But the government wanted that for Rock Creek Park, and they got it. There's a little kind of an interesting story on that the land was thought to have a little bit of gold on it. As you know, there are gold deposits around here. There's some in Montgomery County. And the son of Peirce Shoemaker, who was actually educated at Georgetown, he got a law degree and went into real estate, he argued that you can't take this land from us, and has gold on it, et cetera, without a fair price. Didn't like the price they were offering. Well, this was not accepted by the U.S. government, and they argued it on lower courts, and then they finally ended up at the Supreme Court of the United States arguing over this point. And the Shoemakers lost 8-0. The government said, look, this is federal land anyway because you're within the District of Columbia, so you don't even own it, so don't even think about trying to get compensated for the gold. Basically, that was the argument. So he had to take what they gave him, and he did pretty well. So it really wasn't such a horrible outcome. And eventually, he ended up being a big promoter of the park. That was Lewis Peirce. This is Joshua, sorry. He was the man who had the nursery, and he called it Linnaean Hill, after Linnaeus, the Swedish man who invented the Latin nomenclature system. This is Joshua Peirce Klingel, who was the adopted son of Joshua Peirce, the horticulturalist. Joshua Peirce Klingel really wasn't into the nursery business, and he got out of it pretty quickly after his father died. But he got that house, which is called Klingel Mansion today. It was called Linnaean Hill then, the whole estate. It's up there off of Williamsburg Lane, near Porter Street, and where Klingel Road comes down. And there was a Klingel Road that he used to get across the creek, and that's where the name came from. So just getting back a bit to the slavery situation at the mill, another thing that helped the research that I was doing was the fact that a lot of things have been archived recently, collected, gathered together, digital records, et cetera. So